mountains have many meanings. And in our conversation today, we'll have the chance to explore a few of these meanings. One of the meanings of a mountain is that it represents wilderness. It's a wild place. And if we look around us in today's world, we find the world is rapidly losing its wild places. The world is becoming paved over and domesticated, and the wild creatures are retreating more and more to the margins and losing their habitat. There are few wild places left, and where there are wild places, more and more there's a sense of duty on the part of those who feel that duty to respect those places, venerate them, protect them, and visit them, yes, as a kind of pilgrimage, but in a spirit of reverence. Perhaps some of you have had an experience of being in a totally wild place. It's getting rarer and rarer in our time, but a place where you can't anymore hear the sounds of cars, for instance. A place where your cell phone doesn't have coverage. A place where you really have to make sure that you have the sustenance you need to survive. Can you think of times when you've been in such a place and what it does to you? Thoreau. We've come back to Thoreau many times in these gatherings, but let's mention him again. You know, Thoreau spent that year at Walden, which was a semi-wild place, and certainly he delved into the depths of the wildness that was there, but it wasn't so far out of town vis-a-vis Concord. If you go to Concord, you can more or less walk over to Walden in little time. But once Thoreau went to a very wild place in Maine, Mount Katahdin, and he hiked the mountain, passing through what are called the burnt lands. And because of the swirling clouds and wind and all of the obstacles along the way, he never quite got actually to the summit. But when he came down again, he was moved to the core by what he had encountered there, and he described it saying, "This was that earth of which we have heard, made out of chaos and old night. Man was not to be associated with it. It was matter, vast, terrific, rocks, trees, wind on our cheeks." So pure mentalism, a pure contact. He kept repeating the word contact, contact. The contact of the senses with space, with rock and root and sky, beyond all of the social niceties of the world with which we have familiarized ourselves, back to the sheer experience of spirit in body as if for the first time. So mountains, still to this day, for many of us, signify a place that is not yet paved over, a genuine wilderness. Now, mountains may also suggest the world itself. Mountains are massive, unmovable, a force to be reckoned with, something you cannot deny. Just as the world is a fact around you, the mountain is a sheer fact. It's there. You've got to contend with it one way or another. You might experience it as a barrier. You might experience it as something to climb, but however you experience a mountain, you can't deny it. So the world is like this, the physical world. And it, as Rumi reminds us, Maulana Rumi, Qaddasallahu Sirruhu, the world echoes our voice. Whatever we put out into the world, it comes back to us. So Rumi says in his Masnavi, this world is the mountain, and our action the shout. The echo of the shouts come back to us. Every mountaineer knows that when you're confronting a great peak, if you let out a loud sound, you're going to hear it come back to you. Now that doesn't happen in the lowlands, but it happens among the mountains. An echo is a phenomenon of the mountains. And Rumi says the world is like that. Whatever we put out, it's going to come right back to us. So that's karma. Now, inasmuch as the world is a mountain, is a sheer fact, we have the expression moving mountains. Moving mountains refers to a great endeavor. For instance, love can move mountains. What does that mean? Even the greatest obstacle, even the greatest barrier, there may be a way through if the motivation is strong enough, if you have a profound, overwhelming passion to reach a certain destination, you might be able to move mountains. And the legendary symbol of moving mountains is the figure of Farhad, who loved Shirin in the old romance of Shirin and Farhad. Shirin was a concubine of the king, Khusro. But this sculptor named Farhad, he was deeply in love with and devoted to Shirin. And the promise was, if he would carve his way through the mountain, if he would carve a channel through the mountain, then Shirin's love would be his. And so he labored and labored at the seemingly impossible task with a pickaxe, and finally made a passage through the mountain. And it was then that, sadly, a dirty trick was played on him, which is that the king sent to him the false report that Shirin had died. And he leapt off the mountain, and that was his own demise. So it's a melancholy romance of olden times, but the central theme of the story is that love can move mountains. Now, just as a mountain might symbolize this world, very often it symbolizes the next world. It symbolizes the hereafter. And this is evident in the 7th chapter of the Quran Sharif, which has the title Al-Araf. Al-Araf means the heights. And this chapter of the Quran describes a high place which is between hell and heaven. And you can see both places from that middle place, that barzakh, which is really purgatory, a purgatorial state, a kind of preparatory state where you can see the consequences of your choices. This Araf, which, by the way, is also the title of a fascinating poem by Edgar Allan Poe. But Araf is cognate with Mount Qaf, Qaf Mountain, which is sometimes associated with the Alborz mountain in Iran, but more often recognized as the cosmic mountain that William Irwin Thompson spoke of, how this whole reality forms a means of ascending. And so Al-Araf is Qaf with its emerald peak, emerald being the color that outlasts all colors. And it must have been this conception that influenced Dante Alighieri in his depiction of purgatory, which he described as a mountain with 7 levels. And at each level, those who climb the mountain must contend with a certain aspect of human experience which is limiting. These are, namely, the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. And there are those who get stuck at each level, and they won't be able to move on until they have come to terms with that problem in their own psyche and resolved it and found the way through, until they've overcome, let's say, an addiction and seen another possibility and found the way forward. And they find that by means of guidance and the illustration of ideals that transcend the limitation of the state that they've got caught up in. So this is a very significant and influential way of conceiving the hereafter, that we'll have to address aspects of our life that remain unresolved at the time of our death. And we do so through a process of internal healing, healing our own confusions and misguided inclinations, purification step by step. Now, having mentioned Dante, I have to acknowledge that the name of Dante is very painful for many, perhaps most, Muslims, on account of the fact that Dante depicts the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Imam Ali alayhi salam, those great illuminated beings who were an immense light of guidance in this world and of healing, depicting them as occupying one of the circles of hell, astaghfirullah, and receiving punishment ostensibly for, ironically, fomenting a schism and discord, when in fact the message of the Prophet was and is tawheed, or bringing people together, people of different faiths together and acknowledging all of the preceding prophets. So there's a tremendous misunderstanding on Dante's part, sadly, on this point. And one can understand, therefore, why for many Muslims, even despite Dante's drawing upon Islamic lore as extensively as he did, and he did so very extensively. In fact, his entire Divine Comedy can be seen as modeled on the mirage of the prophet. So there's a kind of terrible irony in, on the one hand, deriving that inspiration and at the same time giving such offense to the community of those who follow the Holy Prophet. How can we come to terms with this? Perhaps we can come to terms with it by understanding that just as Dante foresaw that in the hereafter each of us would have to come to terms with our own limitations, Dante himself must be coming to terms with the misunderstandings of his own lifetime, and quite possibly, and we can certainly hope and pray this is true, moving beyond them and seeing beyond and going through a kind of purification. And an example of this is to be found in the way that William Blake tells us that Milton appeared to him, descended from the sky, appeared to him, and communicated that there were certain things that he, Milton, had written in Paradise Lost that he now regretted, misunderstandings that he had had, and he wanted now to correct the record. So authors of the past, thinkers of the past, we can't just think of them as being stuck in the past and stuck in the ideas that they put down on paper centuries ago. Their spirits also are evolving just as history is transforming. And we can certainly imagine that Milton is transforming in the hereafter, and that Dante is opening up to new perspectives. And just as Milton came to Blake, any day now, Dante will come to one of us and provide some emendations to his work, inshallah. Now, mountains are also a place where paradise can be touched. And this is certainly known to the indigenous people of all lands, and there are certainly holy mountains and even holy hills all over the world that to this day are honored by the people of those lands. One can think of Mount Fuji, Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Shasta, Machu Picchu, Mount Kailash, just to name a few. And these are places where over the centuries, seekers of guidance have retreated to access holy wisdom. In the Beni Israeli tradition, it's said that Eden, the Garden of Eden, sat on the top of a mountain actually, Adam's Peak in Sri Lanka. According to long-standing lore, it was on Adam's Peak that Adam and Eve lived in the paradisial state, God bless them, before their, as it were, exile. And then, in later times, it was on another mountain, Mount Sinai, that Musa alayhi salam, Moses, ascended in order to encounter the divine presence and received revelation. He called out on the mountaintop, Rabb arani, Lord, reveal yourself to me. And the answer came, Lan tarani, you cannot see me. But at that very moment, he collapsed, and his very inability to see became another kind of sight. He couldn't be, the divine couldn't be seen in any kind of ordinary way, but strangely, not seeing him, absolutely not seeing him, became seeing God, who is him, who is her, who is everything conceivable. And then, of course, the prophet had to come down the mountains with the tablet of the law, and that's another story, what followed from that. In the lifetime of Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, it was from the peak of the Mount of Olives, it was from the Mount of Olives that Jesus ascended to heaven, according to the book of Acts. And in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he retreated to Jabal Nur, just outside Mecca, to the cave of Hira, and secreted himself there during Ramzan, and fasted and prayed and meditated, and it was then that revelation came. It was then that he heard the voice of Spirit say, Iqra, the voice of the angel Gabriel, recite, and the whole Quranic revelation began on a mountaintop. So, you see, prophecy is very closely connected with mountains. Revelation is very closely connected with mountains. And so, mountains represent wilderness, the world, the next world, the contact between heaven and earth, but also, and perhaps ultimately, mountains represent the self, one's very self. Now, historians of Western history sometimes point to something that Petrarch did in the 14th century as a pivotal moment. Petrarch, the poet, he climbed Mount Ventoux, and historians will say, until then, we don't have a record of anyone saying that they were climbing a mountain for the view. People climbed mountain according to the records. They climbed mountains because they had to get to the other side. But here's the first case of someone that is said to have climbed the mountain for the view. And as he was climbing the mountain, he met a shepherd, and he said, "Have you been up the mountain?" And the shepherd said, "Oh, well, I did once before, but there were just some brambles and rocks, so there didn't seem any point to go there again." But what Petrarch's act of climbing the mountain suggests is that he was looking for a view, and that interest symbolized something new in the Renaissance. But it wasn't only the view that captivated Petrarch at the peak. He began to recollect his own life, think back on the way he had led his life, and there's something about a mountaintop that lends itself to this, because you have an overview. You can see the big picture instead of being just down in the trenches. You can look back, almost as if looking back over time and looking over the future. And at that very moment, he took out Augustine's Confessions and opened up a page which said, "People are moved to wonder by mountain peaks, by vast waves of the sea, by broad waterfalls on rivers, by the all-embracing extent of the ocean, by the revolutions of the stars. But in themselves, they are not interested." So Augustine was saying there that yes, there are many marvels of creation all around us, but who is looking at themselves as a marvel, as a miracle to be explored? Now, this points us back to ourselves, but do we need to be pointed away from the mountain in order to be pointed back to ourselves? After all, we wouldn't be who we are if the mountain wasn't what it is, and the mountain wouldn't be what it is, to us at least, if we weren't who we are. So there's a symbiosis. can we delve into ourselves by climbing the mountain? And this is what the great nature writer of Scotland, Nan Shepherd, communicates. Having roamed the Cairngorm mountains for so long, she wrote of her experiences, and what she wrote is that she found that the mountain became her very self, and in exploring it she was realizing herself. She said, "It is a journey into being. For as I penetrate more deeply into the mountain's life, I penetrate also into my own. For an hour I am beyond desire. I am not out of myself, but in myself. I am. To know being, this is the final grace accorded from the mountain."